we're going to have a panel discussion if you still have any energy for all this stuff. I first saw Dr. Sobey in July of 1963. I was 6 months old. No, that's a joke. I began therapy in earnest that September, and I saw him for a while, and then he put me on every other week, and then every third week, and then in January 1965 he discharged me. I still don't know if that's because he thought I was healthy, or he thought that's as far as he could go with me, or I'm not sure why exactly. I then saw him roughly 10 times a year through 1968, saw him once in 69, and began seeing him again in the early 70s, but it was the time of the oil boycott. And I was living upstate, I was living in Ithaca, New York at the time. I remember on one occasion I had to abandon my car somewhere in the Catskills because I had an odd license plate number and only people with even license plate numbers could get gas that day. Some of you have no idea what I'm talking about, but it's an interesting part of American history. I want to say a little bit about the historical context of the literature at the time, since I'm going to be reading from a book that I wrote back then. When I first started to see Dr. Sobey, the only literature on ergonomy that was available were books written by Wilhelm Reich. In 1960, Selected Writings came out. In 61, The Function of the Orgasm and Character Analysis, and in 62, The Sexual Revolution. There were no secondary source material on Reich, except for some stuff that had been published in England, and I didn't know about it then. There had been a journal being published in England. However, I had access to all of the Reich literature. I, at an early period, was reading the International Journal of Sex Economy and Orgone Research, Orgone Energy Bulletin, CORE, the Einstein Affair, and even Contact with Space, because I had a mentor who was actually my teacher, and I'll call him Arzi, A-R-Z-I. Arzi had all the material, so he let me borrow it, and I read all of this stuff in the early 60s. Now that material is all available through the Reich Museum. They've been publishing Xerox copies of these journals. It was also through Arzi that I was led to Dr. Sobey. Things began to change in the mid-60s, and here's a little handout that'll make things a little easier. My able assistant, Professor Coley, will distribute these handouts. In 1964, an article on Reich appeared in Commentary magazine by Philip Reif. He went on to write a book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic, which included this thing he wrote. And shortly thereafter, Ellsworth Baker's book came out in Baker's book came out in 67, and we've already referred to it today. The book by Chester Rayfield that came out in 1970 was in direct response to Baker's book, and is a very, I think, trenchant critique of Man in the Trap, and well worth reading. And you can buy the Rayfield book from the Wilhelm Reich Museum. I clearly remember when Ohlendorf's book came out and how pissed off Dr. Sobey was about it. He was very angry. He felt that her motivation was not clear or correct, and he didn't understand why she would want to write this book. But generally, all of these books either came out when I was in therapy, or I saw Sobey later, and he was dismissive of them all. His position was, you want to know about Reich, you read Reich. You don't read any secondary source material. So I wanted to write a book about Reich. And I did so in fear and trembling of the wrath of Dr. Sobey, which I had encountered on numerous occasions by really being a screw-up, and he would let me know it. Let me say something about the David Elkind piece. This was classic. The New York Times Magazine, I don't remember the exact date, it was sometime in April of '71, the cover of the New York Times Magazine was the Steig drawing, You're Afraid of Life. You know, the little guy sitting inside the flower. And the lead article was by Elkine, who was at the University of Rochester at the time. At that time, I was a professor, and I wrote to Elkine a very careful letter, point by point, telling him the way in which he was wrong, at least in my eyes. And the Times Magazine printed a couple of letters critical of Elkine for taking Reich too seriously. They say, "Why are you writing about Reich? He was a crackpot. He was a quack. He abused people. All this crazy stuff." And here I read this very detailed criticism from the other side, and I get this very polite note from David Elkine saying, "As you know, Professor Bennett, I was attacked in the New York Times for being too nice to Reich. You're writing a letter saying I was too hard on Reich. Therefore, I achieved the balance I was seeking in my article." And I wanted to throttle the guy. You know, here I gave him a very detailed point by point. Maybe he was one of the first fair and balanced kind of folks we need to deal with these days. In any case, when it came for me to write my book on Reich, which I began in September of '76, I did so with a certain amount of concern. I wrote this text between September '76 and May of '77. I put it aside and went off and had an adventure living in a mail truck. I became the gypsy philosopher, but that's another story. I eventually wrote to Dr. Sobey, and he actually said he didn't see any problems with my book. I revisited this text in 2005 and edited it and had visions of completing it, but now I'm finding myself having much more fun writing more scholarly kind of work, and I'll probably never publish this book. Unless after hearing this text you say, "Oh, you got to love it." Okay, my first session with Dr. Sobey, July 1963, part 1. The appointment is for 10 a.m. I leave New Brunswick on the 8 o'clock suburban transit bus, arriving at Port Authority shortly after 9. I take the IND Express downtown and get off at West 4th Street. They call that the A train. I grew up with IND and IRT and BNC.
Still the IND.
I know, but no one knows what you're talking about if you talk about it that way. The red line. I walk over 8th Street East towards University Avenue. So far, so good. Place, thank you. This is all familiar territory. It was called Avenue in those days. No, I'm kidding. This is all familiar territory, though not at this hour. Trips to the village are part of my routine. We sometimes will drive up from New Brunswick for beers at the White Horse, to visit Dylan's ghost, bumping into others making that pilgrimage. The other Dylan may also be in the village those nights, but we've only just begun to hear of him. I enter 50 East 10th Street and ask the doorman for Dr. Sobey's office. At the end of the hallway on your left. I walk into the 2-bedroom apartment, which has been converted into a 2-doctor treatment center. 1 bedroom for Dr. Handelman, who sees patients in the city half the time and at his home in Newark half of the time, and 1 bedroom for Dr. Sobey. The living room is the waiting room. And later I find out that the kitchen is something of a laboratory, with a TO-T setup and a microscope to do the Reich blood test. I enter the living room to wait. I enter the waiting room to live. I enter this room and neither wait nor live. I quake. Fortunately, no one else is in the room. No sounds except for the FM radio softly playing WQXR. I shall come to know this room well. I will study the artwork, gifts from patients. I will add to its decor with gifts of my own. But on this day, I suspect that I see little. I sit in a leather armchair and enter a state of suspended inanimation. I am wearing a suit for this occasion. It is blue and expensive. It belonged to my Uncle Morton, my mother's youngest brother, who dropped dead from a heart attack at 36. Why is heart attack? I am 34 as I write this, but I am not my Uncle Morton.
Was he married?
And I'm not 34 as I read this. Actually, I found out recently he didn't drop dead from heart. He killed himself, but it wasn't known. He enters the waiting room, hand outstretched.
Mr. Bennett, follow me. Well, how do you do it? Follow me.
There we go. That will be the only imitation of Dr. Sobe you will hear tonight. He is shorter than I am. He has a big build with a large chest and stomach, though he is not fat. He's balding. His voice is rough, that of a New York businessman, a retailer of some sort, perhaps a grocer. He is slightly pigeon-toed. Though it is only the beginning of the summer, he is well tanned. We enter the treatment room. He seats himself behind his desk and indicates that I should sit in a chair facing him. He opens a notebook to a blank page and writes in it as he asks me some simple questions about me and my family. He knows that I'm a student of Arzy's and that Arzy has referred me. He asked me why I've come for therapy. He asked me what I know about Reich. And he asked me if I believe that Orgone Energy exists. Yes, of course. Oh, why? Well, I recently did this experiment. The Orgone Energy rotisserie, a natural science experiment, or how we scared ourselves silly seeing blue clouds in the dark, May 1963. By the May of 1963, I was a true believer in the Church of Orgone Energy, Wilhelm Reich, proprietor and God. I strongly resisted this characterization then, and it was precisely the nature of my commitment that Cohen, and I would often discuss during our late night, early morning arguments in the New Brunswick lunch, the NBL. The all-night diner on French Street across from the train station, 2 doors down from the storefront that served as the in-town ticket office for the Suburban Transit Bus Company, the place where you waited for the New York City Express, the bus you took when going to the museum, to the flicks in the village, to the coffee houses, and very soon to your therapist. We talk about orgasm, about what's natural, about musculature, about energy. Our discussions are often centered on arguments from authority, since neither I, the missionary, nor they, the reticent primitives, have ever done any tests ourselves on the subject. In fact, they haven't even read his books. I reason as follows. When you read Reich's books, you just know that he's not a conscious fraud looking to dupe you for profit. This leaves 3 possibilities. 1, he's a madman and has dreamed up all this stuff. 2, the things he has observed admitted of alternative explanations consonant with recognized scientific theory. 3, he's right. Hypothesis 2 is not a serious candidate. The temperature difference experiment with the accumulator contradicts the second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy. This is why Einstein said that were this experiment confirmed, it would be a bomb to physics. Coming from Einstein, that's quite a choice of metaphors. Now, I claim that hypothesis 1 can be eliminated, since Reich did not work alone, but in consort with others whose sanity is beyond question. This is me speaking. He only trained MDs, and the researchers working with him were PhDs. There's this professor in biology at McGill who confirmed Reich's experiments in biogenesis, the Bion experiment, experiment 20. And look at it this way. You know Arzy, Korn had flirted with philosophy, and he's rational, right? Well, he underwent therapy with Sobey for years. Does it make sense that he underwent therapy with a kook? Well then, if Sobey is sane, and he worked with Reich, end of speech. Guilt by association is not the same as sanity by association, or so I reason. Someone can hide their criminal activities, but not their character, attitudes, and perceptions. If Arzy was as hip as he seemed, well then it just sort of followed. And what about A.S. Neal? And what about Saul Bellow? And what about Norman Mailer? And what about... For some reason, our conversation this night takes a different turn. We decide to perform a test. We leave the MBL and cut through the alley towards Patterson Street. It's 3 a.m. The streets are empty. At the last minute, Cohen decides to go home to study. Of the two, they are roommates. Cohen is far more skeptical. For me, that equals resistant. Korn a bad choice of pseudonyms. Korn is more interested in my friendship and seems more open to ergonomy. At that time, I probably attributed this to his greater health. In my world, then, the quicker you recognize the truth and right, the healthier you were. And conversely, the more energy you put into ridiculing Reich, the sicker you were. Though now I think it had more to do with Korn's insecurity, his fear of losing a friend, and here, I guess, a deep-seated hope that perhaps Korn and I enter the third-floor apartment at 47 Patterson Street. I share this apartment with Avram. He's asleep in the bedroom, his door closed. We enter the kitchen, which, with a large bookcases of partition, is also my bedroom. In the pantry closet sits Avram's old rotisserie, our Orgone Energy accumulator to be. Rotisseries are no longer part of the standard American kitchen, replaced by the toaster oven and now the microwave, but in the 50s, every house had one. A rotisserie is a metal box 2 feet wide, a foot deep, a foot or so tall, with an electric heating element on top and provisions for an electrically operated spit. You could grill your hamburgers, staple in the house of my youth, or rotobroil your chicken, as Avram sometimes did in our Orgone Energy accumulator to be. The rotisserie has a glass door, but it's metal on 5 sides, and we can use the tray to cover the front, thereby get our enclosure. We wrap the rotisserie in a blanket, our non-metallic outer layer, leaving room to look in, for our experiment concerns the visual confirmation of the existence of the Orgone. We make the room light tight as best we can. We drape blankets over the windows and put a towel on the floor in front of the door. It is dark. It is spooky. We sit and sweat. Now, according to Reich, I try to speak with authority, but the nervous quiver in my voice renders this attempt comical. We should see a blue iridescent cloud when we look in. I mean, it's not really seeing in the sense of light reflecting off an object and hitting the optic nerve, but our retina is sensitive to this energy and we should see it. After waiting for our eyes to adjust to not seeing, we take turns looking in our rotisserie Orgone Energy accumulator. We both see it. Yes, after looking in for a while, there it is, blue to dark purple, glowing ragged edge there. Ultimately, after you look for a while, if you look away, it's still there. Afterimage, Reich speaks of that. And sure enough, if we relax our eyes, the afterimage fades, only to be reactivated by looking in our accumulator. We have done it. We've seen Orgone Energy. I think I'm more turned around than Korn. My God, it really does exist. By the way, I interject a little thought here about bions and binus. All the stuff in this rotisserie that we never cleaned, all the fat, the breadcrumbs, all this stuff. I mean, it must have been a very energetic place. Back to the session with Dr. Sobey. Dr. Sobey speaking, that doesn't prove that it was Orgone Energy that you saw. No more imitation. Though I suspect that he's baiting me, I say nothing. All right, Mr. Bennett. Dr. Sobey gets up from his desk and moves towards the door, no doubt to make what is to follow easier. Please remove your clothes and lie down on the bed. I knew it was coming. I am well prepared, but still, a little commentary on taking off the clothes. When Dr. Sobey returns to the room, I'm lying on the couch in my jockey briefs and socks. He instructs me to lie with my arms at my sides, my legs bent at the knees, almost at a 45-degree angle, with my feet flat on the bed. He watches me breathe and tells me to exhale deeply before breathing in. After a while, he says, all right, scream. Momentary panic. Anything in particular? No, just scream. Won't people hear? Don't worry about that. The neighbors are used to it. Scream. Louder. Louder. And then I really screamed. I am panting. He lightly presses on my chest as I exhale. My breath is coming easier and I am much more comfortable. I continue to breathe, and after a while, Dr. Sobey tells me to get dressed. He leaves the room and I slowly put on my suit. Boy, do I feel foolish wearing that suit. Dr. Sobey returns, takes my check for $15. At that time, he charged $30 per session, but $15 for students. And since he's about to leave for his summer vacation, makes my appointment for September 3rd, 10 a.m. I leave his office and head for the subway. My therapy has begun. I want to read one other session. Before I do it, I mean, just the very thought of a doctor these days simply saying, look, take your clothes off, and the doctor touching you. I mean, in certain circles, boom, people go totally ballistic. It's probably totally illegal, et cetera, but who knows. This next section is entitled, They Left Me Alone, September 1963. And I don't know if this is significant, it was my fourth session, because I was told that with Dr. Sobey, after 4 sessions, he either threw you out or you win. That is, he would see if he really thought it could work with you, and he could tell that by the end of 4 sessions. And if he didn't think it would work with you, he would simply say, well, go find someone else. I probably had that in the back of my mind, but who knows. They Left Me Alone, September 1963. During my 4th session with Dr. Sobey, I had my first breakthrough. This event gave content to what up until then had been theory, intellectually grasped in part, passionately defended as a way of quieting my own doubts, but only theory. After this event, I knew. A.S. Neal has said that he got more release out of a few weeks undergoing therapy with Reich than he had from years of talkie analysis. The incident I'm about to describe may help you understand that kind of remark. I am breathing through, lying on my back, arms on my side, legs elevated at the knees, exhaling as deeply and fully as I can. After a while, my hands start tingling, a sensation I encountered during the previous sessions. Though the room is not very warm, I am sweating under my arms. I begin to make this noise, ah, ah. I had made this noise last week too. It just sort of came out and I figured it was best to let it. After a while, Dr. Sobey stops me and asks me what I think that noise means. Maybe I'm laughing at you like you can't touch me. Dr. Sobey nods agreement and says, okay, continue breathing. After a few minutes, he stops me again. On your exhale, I want you to make this sound. Wah! Me. Wah, wah, wah. I'm really getting into this sound. I realize that this is the sound of someone crying, but I'm not crying. I'm not even sad. I don't cry. Big boys don't cry. Not me. My eyes sometimes water at the end of soppy, sentimental movies, concluding scenes to Lassie, things like that. But no, sir, not me. Wah, wah. Faster, more genuine sounding, though I'm in perfect control, a method actor in training. Now, I must tell you that I'm thinking only about making this noise. I realize that I'm sounding more and more like someone who is about to bawl like an infant. But it is all quite voluntary, not a spontaneous ripple. I'm thinking only of this noise. Suddenly, out of nowhere, out of the depths of my unhappiness, locked inside those rigid muscles, come the message. They left me alone. Wah! I am crying like a baby, sobbing deeply, without shame, without restraint. As I cry, I'm flooded with memories from my youth. Memories centered on the lack of love from my parents. They're leaving me for work, leaving me for their social life, what little they had one, leaving me for my older sister, leaving me for each other. I am the abandoned infant, the emotional waif, left on the doorstep of the world, alone, and I cry. Some of the memories are visual fragments. One stands out. I'm looking up from the back seat of a car. It is dark. Through the windows, all I can see are the branches of trees hanging down, menacing. I try to explain to Dr. Sobey the incidents that image accompanies. They'd sniffle. They take me with them when they went visiting. They couldn't afford a sitter or were too cheap, sniffle-wah. And they put me to sleep, and then they carry me out to the car and leave me alone, doors locked, wah-wah. When the initial outburst starts subsiding, I repeat the magic phrase, the key to this block. They left me alone, and I cry deeply and recall. I eventually calm down and tell Dr. Sobey how I hadn't been thinking of anything, that I was suddenly flooded with all these memories of abandonment. This sudden surfacing of memory or image is nothing new to Dr. Sobey. As I tell him, the sadness recedes and anger and resentment towards my parents begins to surface. It's then that Dr. Sobey does something that is deep, wise, and beautiful. He reaches out and gently touches my arm as if to cut me off and says, "They meant well." Even now, this incident I have relived many times before. I feel the power of that counsel. They did mean well. They meant well. They meant well. Well, they meant well, and I'm still working on this incident. What time is our appointment? It's probably I could read more, but that's enough. I'll just tell you one little anecdote. In 1964, I was seeing Dr. Sobey when the Republicans were trying to figure out who was going to run against Lyndon Johnson. Kennedy, as you know, was assassinated in November of '63, and Johnson became president. And the Republicans were considering Barry Goldwater. Sobey says, "It will never happen." And he says, "I'll bet you 100 to 1. And I said, "You're on." And the Republicans nominated Barry Goldwater. And then it came to collecting on the bet. And first he said something like, "I didn't really mean it." So he gave me a number of sessions. I don't know that I got my full $100 worth. I think we ended up agreeing on 3 sessions or something. Chicken that I was. I was a good liberal then, and I'm still a liberal now. That's the problem. If you have any questions, I have 6 more minutes.
Mark would have usually been, "I never said that."
No, he knew. So I got about 6 minutes if you want to ask any questions. Yes, please.
You had the glass surface of the rotisserie covered with the metal pan. How were you looking at it?
Oh, we left the metal pan, just a little space there, and put our eyes up against it. I also did some other experiments back then with fluorescent bulbs, and I had an accumulator. I built an accumulator after this. That accumulator ended up in your apartment in 1971. I knew Coley way back when, before we became a hot item in the gossip columns. Any other questions or comments?
Avenue or 10th Street?
Pardon me? 10th Street, 50 East 10th Street. That's where I saw him. He then moved someplace else.
Well, funny coincidence, 17 years later, in June, I saw him the first time, and then he said, "I'm going to wait for the summer, your next appointment will be in September."
Yeah, he had a way of running away, didn't he?
And when I went back in September, he was on 95th Avenue,
Oh, then he
97th
moved.
Street.
We just moved. That's when I became.
1980.
That's how I just became. They had gone from Madison Avenue, Dr. Handel and Dr. Sobey. Originally we were on Madison Avenue, then they moved to 10th Street, right off of between Broadway and University. And then we moved. Then we moved to 96. And then I was involved in the 97th and 5th Avenue, which was a cause of great strife between Dr. Sobey and Dr. Handel.
Hold on one second, Bob. Let me see if anyone else has any questions or comments before. Any other comments, questions? Yes, go ahead, Merrick, and then Bob.
Just a quick comment about the quality of it. It's beautifully written. It's more interesting than 90% of what gets published nowadays.
Thank you. Thanks, I appreciate that.
Just let me quickly
Good, Bob, go, let's go.
just to tell people, the Dr. Sobey was, some of you, I realize as Dr. Bennett presented, I know that Dr. Sobey had been a close a student and associate of Dr. Reich's. He and Dr. Hamlin, who had both been the youngest of the therapists, continued to do treatment until Dr. Sobey's death in 1995. I just wanted to
Just briefly, I started singing in 1949 at Madison Avenue, and the first thing he had me do was write a little biography. And then the second thing he did was have me sign something saying I wasn't a communist. No.
Different times, different strokes.
Different time. And the third thing was, after the first session, he had me send the accumulator afterwards for 10, 15 minutes. And we did that every session. And so I think I saw him there a good bit, and then actually he was still there in 52, winter 52. And I think we moved downtown after that. But he was a much more aggressive therapist then than he was 5 or 6 years later.
Well, I mean, Dr. Sobey, I'm sorry, man.
I don't know how to compare aggressive or, I mean, I remember some sessions where I felt a certain degree of pain, and there was an accumulator in the waiting room. No, in my case, that wasn't, I don't think that was an issue. But it's funny, because when I saw him, he tried to recruit me into the Communist Party, so I guess things changed. That was a joke, that was a joke. Any other questions or comments from?
Just add that they also kept, like I mentioned, laboratory, which was for doing the blood. They continued to do the right blood tests
Right.
For a number of years.
Were they doing that?
Yeah. And they also had, which had been disconnected by the time I started with them, a very, very well-constructed door buster, which was hooked, which went through the bathroom wall, through the wall of the office into the bathroom.
Right.
And when asked why he wasn't, because I wanted him to use it on me at one point, he said, well, we get all sorts of results, but I don't understand what's going on.
He did use it on me. I remember once showing up sick, and the session consisted of him opening up the tap. The pipes are in the bathtub of the bathroom, which was adjacent to his office. And I remember him opening up the tap and just going back and forth with the buster or the chute or whatever we're talking about here, because who knows whether it's taking away or putting in. But he once did that. But energy was not my issue, and it continues not to be my issue to this day. It's the management of energy, which is more my issue. I've always been a pretty highly energetic kind of character. It's time to bring up some other chairs, and thank you. Thanks.